Hey everybody, welcome back. I want to take a little bit of time today to look at textures and materials, what they are, and how you can interact with them at a basic level inside of Unreal. First off, a texture is simply just an image file. So if you look at the folders that I have here, I've imported two different textures. The textures are imported as PNGs, but you can import a number of different types of assets into Unreal. You can click and drag them if you know that it's an asset type that Unreal supports. If you're not sure about that, click on the import option and look at the drop down to make sure that the asset type you're trying to import is on the list. Once you import the asset, you want to name it appropriately. I've named the checkerboard appropriately, but the chevron is coming in and it's just the name of the asset that was imported. I want to change the name. I'm going to press F2 to do that, and we're going to use T underscore as a designation in Unreal so we can identify it as a texture. You'll also note that there's a red underline for textures here. Everything inside of Unreal's content browser is color coded. Now, a texture exists as an image, but the material that we're going to use in the game is actually a set of instructions that tells the engine renderer how to interpret the texture. So when we think about the texture, think that that is not going to be what shows up on the image of or the player's going to see. They're going to see a representation of that being interpreted by the renderer. So I can't just put this texture directly onto the material or onto the static mesh and expect it to work. It's going to need to generate a material for that. So I can, in this particular case, take this texture and apply it to this cube. And you'll notice in the corner it says Material T Checkerboard 64 Matte Created. So when I look back here, I have a material now, not just a texture. The texture has a red underline and the material has a green underline. All right, so let's say this is sufficient for us, but we need to rename this. Anytime you're going to have a material, we want it to have an M underscore, and we don't need to have that extra long suffix. Now, this is a problem because this isn't the folder that we wanted this to be in. I have textures and I have materials. So I'm just going to click and drag that over there and say move here. But there's also other ways I can create this. So I'm going to go ahead and delete it and show you those. So this now no longer has a reference to whatever material I was pointing at. I can choose a material from a drop-down list if I had any in my project. So now I'm going to take this texture and I can do something else. I can right-click and say create material, and it'll create that material right here. And it basically does all that hookup for us to get the material set up in the way that we want, and then we can move this asset over. Or if we wanted to have a little bit more control over the structure of our files, and we don't want to lose something in the myriad of assets you're eventually going to end up with in a large game, is I can go to the place where I want the asset to live. I can right click and say material, create the material, call it M underscore checkerboard. And then when I open that up, I can pull the texture in by myself. So how do I get the texture into the material? So the textures can be clicked and dragged into the material space, and it'll create a texture sample. If I have a texture already selected, and I go to this the context menu by right-clicking, I can grab a texture sample, and it'll automatically populate. If I don't have anything selected, and I do that same action, then I will get a blank texture sample. So if I click T, I get a blank texture sample, and if I have it selected and I click T, it'll give me the texture sample that I currently have selected in the content browser. If you have a lot of textures you're going to be working with, for example, you have diffuse color and a metallic, a specular, a roughness, a normal, right? All those things as separate textures. You can select multiple assets inside of the content browser and then click and drag them, and it will create a texture sample for each one. Once I'm inside of the browser, you'll notice that the left to right movement that you'd expect from a blueprint is different than inside of a material. The material graph looks to have a bunch of data inform the material on the right, whereas a blueprint has a lot of events and functions that perform actions to the right. So I'm just going to hook this up, the RGB, to the base color. Once I do that, I can see that the preview object has changed its representation. If I click on the other shapes, it'll show the preview in different contexts. If I have a particular material I want to try this out on to see what it looks like just in the editor, I can go to my meshes, select one here, and then click this object icon here to show that this is the object that I'm going to be testing the material on. Coming back to the material graph, you'll notice there's a lot of nodes that are available over here. What nodes are available is dependent upon what domain you select inside of the details panel for the material. So when I go to the details panel for the material, I'll have surface. If I expect this thing to exist on a static mesh inside of the world, on the wall, on the ceiling, on the floor, on a couch, whatever it is, I'm going to want to choose surface. Some of these other options are available, and they do different things in terms of how they interact with the rendering system and when and how they will render the material. If I select them, you'll notice there'll be a difference in what things are available over here to the right. So just be mindful of what it is you're trying to accomplish and choose the right domain. In addition to the domain, you have different blend modes. These are instructions for how the material is going to interact with other elements inside the world and inside the graphics rendering pipeline. Sometimes you want to have the opaque thing there, meaning that it's just solid. Sometimes you want it to be masked, saying that there's a certain area that's cut out of it, or a translucent object that lets some light go through in some areas, but less or more in another area. And it's not masked to be either translucent or not, or transparent or not. It is translucent, and there's a volume of light that's going to pass through the object. And there's some variations on that here as well. The shading model you're going to use is going to inform how the thing is going to interact with the lighting system. If you have two-sided foliage, I would say use that. Subsurface details for more natural lighting. When you come down here, there's a few other options that you might want to look through. And then if you have subsurface selected, then subsurface profiles would need to be defined here as well. So this texture sample is really all we need to get started. As a level designer, this is the majority of what you're going to do. You're going to come in and you're going to add a image to a material, and then you're going to take that image and you're going to apply it to an object. So now that I have this, I'm going to go to my materials, then click and drag, and this is going to be applied to the static mesh. Materials apply to an entirety of a static mesh, and sometimes you'll have multiple elements, and you can choose which element it goes into, but it applies for the whole static mesh. This is different than working with geometry or BSP, where if I apply the material, it gets applied per surface. If I have a material that is selected inside of my content browser, I can hold down the Alt key and then left click to apply that material more uniformly. Or I can select an object, select the matching brush, and then I can apply the object, the material to the entire object. If I have it selected in my browser here, I'll just use this push icon and it will push the material to the entirety of the object. Working with different types of assets, sometimes you want them to be a little bit more dynamic. For example, I have this picture frame. I know that I want the background here or the frame to have a checkerboard pattern, but the area inside of the frame, I want to have something a little bit more interesting. I want to have a moving image. For this, I'm going to need to take a material and add some dynamism to it. So I'm going to start off by looking at the texture that I have here for this chevron. Looking at it, by default, it's a little rough. If I take the alpha off, you can see that it's a fairly chunky image, kind of crunchy in the graphics. But if I turn the alpha back on, it looks a little bit more nuanced in the way that I have alpha that's going to allow for some translucent light to come through in different areas. So this is going to tell us that we're going to need to use something different than the default material setup. If I want to convert this into a material, I'm going to be able to use one of the methods that we discussed. Because I have a specific location I want my materials to live, I'm going to go ahead and go there now. I'm going to create a new material. I'm going to call it m_chevron. And when I go in here, I can select and click and drag this texture sample and hook it up to my base color. Now, by default, this looks pretty bad. This is not going to be useful for me as I want to represent content of a moving arrow inside of this frame. So I'm going to need to make some adjustments. I'm going to look at this RGB and see what I have here. I definitely want emissive color to come through. I want it to be bright, that it's going to be generating its own light inside of the scene, so it'll look more like a neon light. But I don't have anywhere to plug my alpha into. So what I'm going to need to do is going to explore my blend mode to see if I have other options that will allow me to get this transparency included in the calculation for how it's going to interpret the material or the texture. So I'm going to come down here and I'm going to go to translucence gray transmittance. And when I do that, I get this opacity override. So if I take my alpha channel and roll it into my opacity override, then you'll notice I'm starting to get that neon sign look that I was going for, where the outside edges are dithered with some light passing through, and the inside is completely solid, and then I have this gap in between. So I'm actually showing a variety of different alpha representations from just one texture. So the alpha channel that I exported, because this was a PNG with alpha, is going to be able to be plugged directly in there. So this is a good start. If I come back, I can select my world material, element channel 2, and I'm going to choose that chevron. And you can see now immediately light's passing through, it's behaving appropriately. The back face of the material of the object is solid, so this is not going to be a problem for the purposes that I have, that this is meant to sit on a wall. But you may consider that you have an object that does not have a back face and might need to include that this would be a two-sided texture, because if you're inside of the asset, you'll notice that the material is not visible from this side. What I would like is to have this arrow move from left to right, indicating the player should move in that direction. So I'm going to go into my material, and I'm going to add some dynamism to it. Generally, when you're working with an asset, you're going to be interacting with its texture coordinates. And so we can reference those directly. I can go to the texture coordinates, and this is going to be a baseline for how I can control and modify the asset and the contents inside of it. I want to apply a panning option onto this. So from the UV, I'm going to add a panner. Now, I don't necessarily need a texture coordinate for this, but it's nice to have in case I decide I wanted to add a few more controls that are going to need this reference. And sometimes you need to convert these to different assets. There's a lot of tech art that goes into material design. I'm just going to show you some of the simple things that allow you to do some helpful design decisions. Inside of this asset, I have the ability to control the speed on the X and the Y value. So if I increase this, you'll notice that the asset will start scrolling in that direction. If I increase the Y value, it'll start scrolling in that direction. So if I want the arrow to move in the direction that it's pointing, then I'll just modify the Y value. All right, I can control this over time. There are the ability to modify this over time, that it has a scaler to the speed that would increase or decrease, or that would be modified that it would pan over time at a particular rate. We can do that, but this is just a basic panner that will allow us to get the adjustments that we would like here. So now I have this asset, and this is going to be usable for me to maneuver things around. If I wanted to direct the character around, I can put the arrows in place that are going to show them where they should go. It's going to create a little neon cyberpunk style effect. And you can, of course, use this in any number of ways. If you have tank treads or something like that, this is actually a great way to do it without having to model anything. If you want to control things like tank treads or conveyor belts over time, you're probably going to want to modify the material through some sort of code effect. If your content is distracting over here on the side, you can always just press Control R to turn off real-time rendering, and it will only update when you move the viewport then, as opposed to all the time. If I want to modify this speed over time, I'm going to need to be able to pass this value through as a variable. So to be able to do that, what I'd like to do is create a parameter. So I have different types of parameters. A vector parameter is going to give me three values. A 4-vector parameter is going to give me 3 values plus an alpha. So pressing 1 and click, 2 and click, 3 and click, and 4 and click will get me these different values. But then to turn them into a parameter, I have to right click and then convert these to parameters. So convert to parameter, convert to parameter, convert to parameter. Now I can use these things externally, potentially as variables. I only need the one value for speed here, but speed is a 2-variable value. So to be able to get that out, I'm going to create a 2-vector, and I'm going to convert it to a parameter, and I'm just going to call it speed. And you'll notice that it automatically generated a 3-variable parameter with alpha. So I really have the RGB, which is too much, and I can't plug in red and green into this at the same time. So I have to do something where I mask out my values. So I'll do a component mask, and over here I can choose which mask elements are included. So if I include all of them, it's basically not masking out anything. And if I say I only want the red and green values, then I'm going to mask in the first and second value into the first and second value here. If I chose to mask in the red and blue values, then the red and blue is what I'm going to be using. So here, with the 2 values, set it to speed. Now I can step into the next thing that I'd like to do, which is to create a material instance. So right now, none of these things are moving. What I'd like to do is have a uniform speed for all of these that I can control in the world or potentially through code. In order to do that, I would need to take this asset, and I'm going to convert it to a material instance. And the material instance isn't actually a conversion, it's referencing the original. So the material instance is a more optimized version of something that has some parametric controls in terms of the material world. So I'm going to choose mi as my designator for this, mi underscore, and you'll see that the only difference between these is a slightly darker green, and it says material instance as opposed to material here. So be sure that you're grabbing the right one. Typically, if you have something that's in the world a lot, you're going to want to use a material instance. So I'm going to repopulate this asset and this asset with the correct material instance. And now when I go into my material instance for the chevron, I have this parameter over here called speed. And with speed set up, I know that red is going to be for my horizontal adjustment, and that green is going to be for my vertical adjustment. So these values are now able to be controlled uniformly, and I can see them in world on all the assets that I have and make adjustments as necessary to say like, oh, that's not going as quickly as I would like. There's a way to then take these things and create a dynamic material instance and control that through blueprints. A video for another time, but this gives you an idea of how you can start to design content with textures and materials, apply them to the world, scale them appropriately, and even create some movement and dynamism to them. I hope this helps you figure out what it is that you need to do to take the next step in your project, and I hope it helps you keep building.